So hey family and friends, it's the weekend and that means it's a great day to make some gravy and meatballs. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to do my version of meatballs. I'm sure you all have your own, but hopefully even if you do make your meatballs as an expert, you might be able to learn something from me today as I take you through the tips on how to make a good meatball and actually two ways that you can actually cook the meatballs as well. So a special shout out to my brother Michael. Hi Mike. He requested the meatball recipe from your recipe box, so we're doing it today. It's a beautiful spring day out there and just in the mood for some good Italian food. So let's get started. I have a really big wide bowl here so that you can actually see what I'm doing. It's not typically the type of bowl that I would use to mix meatballs in. I usually use something that's got, you know, a little higher sides. It's more of a mixing bowl. Today we're using this salad bowl, but so pick your bowl. Make sure it's big enough to hold the meat and the ingredients. I'll give you the ingredient list in the description of the video. This is a legacy gem recipe. There is no card in my box for meatballs. I learned how to make meatballs from my mom years and years ago, and my grandmother actually, and they used no measurements at all. So when I said, how do you decide what goes in the meatball? The answer I got was this much, and they'd pour everything in their hand and then put it into the meat that way. So based on how much of that pocket of your hand they needed, that's how they decided what they put in based on the amount of meat they had. So I'm going to try a little and be a little bit more precise for you today. I'm not going to use my hand, although I actually usually do. We're going to have here today some meatball mix. So this is veal, beef, and pork ground and put together. You can use all of ground beef. You can use turkey or the meatball mix. Those are the three choices I would say you have to make a good meatball. This is about 2 pounds of meat. So that's what we're going to do today. And you really start by breaking it up with a fork from the package and sort of just tossing it together. And when you actually mix the meatballs later on, the three types of meat will get more, you know, melded together and so that every meatball has a little bit of every type of meat in it. The meatball mix, because it's got the 3 different kinds of meat, makes for a really moist and delicious meatball. If you're using turkey, turkey usually doesn't have any fat in it. It's very lean, so you're not going to get as moist a meatball from the meat itself. You're going to have to add some things to it, maybe an extra egg, maybe even a little bit of olive oil to make those meatballs more juicy if you're using turkey. But we're not. This meat is about 80% lean, so there's plenty of good fat to give your meatballs lots of flavor. So choosing your meat for meatballs is an important first step. Then let's go to the ingredients. Now, if you looked at my stuffed artichoke recipe, you'll notice that the ingredients are pretty much the same. They're actually the same. The only thing that's different is the base. So here we're using meat, and with the artichoke we use the bread, right? So what I told you about the stuffed artichoke, I'm going to tell you again about the meatball. You're using your feel, your touch, right? How's that meatball feel when you're putting it together? And you're using your smell, so your sense of smell. So, you know, are you getting from the meat, you know, the aromas that you want to get to make sure that you've got enough flavors in there. So let's start with the breadcrumbs. So here's my first real tip. I use part regular unseasoned breadcrumbs and part Panko breadcrumbs. The reason I use the Panko, they're Japanese. You don't see them a lot in meatballs, but the reason I use the Panko is to make the meatball a little lighter, not so dense. And I find that that really works well. You can, of course, use all regular breadcrumbs. You can use seasoned breadcrumbs if you want. It won't be the same, but you can maybe cut down on some of these other ingredients if you happen to have seasoned breadcrumbs in the cupboard. So I'm going to just do this in tablespoon measures. So here's 1 of the regular, 2 of the regular, there's I guess Panko doesn't want me making meatballs. You can hear him saying stop it in the background. He's my bird, for those of you who don't know. He's an African gray parrot. I have him and I have Panko, who is a yellow-named Amazon, and they are in my kitchen, so they will make background noises, so I apologize for that. So that's 2 tablespoons, and I think I'm going to throw in another 2 of the Panko, because I think this is a lot of meat, and you will need it. Probably about 3 to 4 tablespoons per pound of meat is somewhere where you want to be. So what's that, 1/4 cup each? That makes sense to me. It's about 1/2 cup of breadcrumbs. The next thing we're going to add is my favorite granulated garlic and granulated onion. This is what I use in the stuffed artichokes. It's what I like in the meatballs. You can use onion and garlic powder. Again, I don't like the consistency of those as much as in these recipes as I do the drier granulated. So that's 1 tablespoon for, let's say 1.5. Okay, because now I'm looking at it and I see it, and I don't think it's going to take, this meat is going to take 2 full tablespoons. So I did about 1 1/4 tablespoons of the garlic powder, and I will do the same with the onion powder. About 1 and a little smidge more. Okay, pepper. All right, so let's just say, for argument's sake, we'll put in 1/4 teaspoon of pepper. We'll eyeball it. This is my good fresh ground pepper. I use 3 different kinds of peppercorns in this pepper. One day I should do a little short on that. Gives the pepper a really good flavor. But you know, I said 1/4. Let me do about 1/2 on the pepper. 1/2 teaspoon. And then salt. We're going to be using cheese in here. So again, I don't want a lot of salt because the cheese has salt in it. So I'm just going to put a tablespoon, 1/4 tablespoon of salt in these meatballs, maybe a smooch more. All right. Parsley. So I went out in the garden today and I got some fresh parsley, chopped it up, including some of the lighter, smaller stems. The stems have a lot of flavor, and when you get them from the garden, you know, you can do that. You can use dried parsley. In this recipe, I don't really think it matters. I just use a little bit more of the fresh. So I would say about a tablespoon of parsley is all you're really going to need here. Just enough to see the parsley running through the meat. So there's that. We've got our cheese. Now the cheese, you like the flavor of the cheese, you know, really flavors the meatball well. So let's start with the cheese. So there's a tablespoon. These are heaping tablespoons too, by the way, that I'm doing here with the cheese. 3, 4, let's say 5. That looks pretty good to me. Make sure your cheese is nice and loose, doesn't have any big clumps in it. I buy, you know, fresh cheese, and sometimes when they grate it, you get a piece of the heel or something in there. Make sure you don't have anything that'll give you a hard piece of cheese in your meatball. And lastly, eggs. Now here's the tip with the eggs. The guideline is 1 egg for 1/2 pound of meat. Eggs vary in size, right? So if they're small eggs or just a regular size egg, I would go with that. If they're larger eggs, extra large eggs or jumbo eggs, then that's going to be too many eggs. It's going to be too loose. So today I have extra large eggs, so I'm only going to put 3 into 2 pounds of meat. Don't worry about it if you put 4, or you're dealing with a pound of meat and you put 2 eggs and it looks a little too loose. You can always add more breadcrumbs to soak up that liquid. So it's never going to have a problem if you add too many eggs. Remember, when you're putting eggs in, don't crack them directly into the meat. Sometimes you get a bad egg every once in a while. So I always crack them in a separate bowl and put them in, make sure that they're in good shape before I get them into my recipe so that the eggs don't ruin your whole recipe. So there's 1 egg, here's 2 eggs more, so that's 3 eggs. All right, so that's all the ingredients for the meatballs. So I got my breadcrumbs here in case I need them. I'm gonna just break the eggs up with a fork. These are really nice eggs, they're nice and yellow. I think I got them at the farmer's market. They're really nice eggs. Get them mixed in a little bit with the fork, along with all the other ingredients. All right, and now we're gonna clean that fork up and I'm gonna go in with my hands. Now make sure that you don't have any rings on when you're making meatballs. This is also, by the way, a good meatloaf. If you just mix this all together and shape it into a meatloaf and put it in a baking dish, you've got meatloaf. So I just gave you 2 recipes for the price of 1 here, Mike. So you can feel, you know, the egg in here. You can feel that the meat is nice and moist. And it smells pretty good to me. Not to say that I'm perfect with the dry ingredients all the time, but this is smelling pretty good. The parsley is looking good through here. I can see the parsley running through all of the meat. Where we're shy, and you can actually probably hear this, right? It's wet. So where we're shy is on the breadcrumbs, right? So let me mix everything really good in here. And this was a good bowl choice because you can see what I'm doing here. I guess Panko agrees. Yeah, you can see that everything's coming together really nicely. And I think we need a little bit more breadcrumbs because this is too loose. This consistency is just too loose for a meatball. If you like your meatballs to be, you know, kind of very light and moist, you might, you can try not, putting in so many breadcrumbs. But I like to be able to cut my meatball. I don't like my meatball to fall apart. So let's sprinkle a little bit more of the regular breadcrumbs on top. And just a handful of the panko. Keep it even. Again, like I said, you can do all one type of breadcrumb. Don't drive yourself crazy, trying to do this, but I really do recommend the panko. Sometimes I just use all panko. I don't do a mix, which is fine as well. So, all right, these things are starting to firm up. You can see it's a little harder for me to push around. You don't want too much breadcrumbs because you don't want them to be dry. You just want enough to hold the meat together. And I think we have reached that stage. Okay. So, like I said, if you want, you can take all this, form it into a loaf, and you have meatloaf. That's not what we're doing today. We're gonna do these meatballs. Now, the Weight Watcher in me likes to know how big my meatballs are. So I use a 1/4 cup measure. I go into the meat, trim it off, pull it out, form my meatball. Okay? You can make whatever size meatballs you want. Obviously, the larger the meatball, the longer it's going to take to cook. Some people like a small meatball. Maybe you have kids. You want some little meatballs, and then you want some big meatballs too. You can really do it by hand and just eyeball them. But I kind of like a consistency to them, and I like the 1/4 cup size of meatball that I get. So I am gonna roll all of these meatballs right now, and then come back to you, and we're gonna discuss the next step, which is how to cook them and get them ready to go into the gravy. So stay with me for the next phase. See you in a bit. All right, so all the meatballs are rolled and ready to cook. One little comment when you roll a meatball, right? Take the meat in your hand, put it in that palm of your hand, and then press down, right? Get it nice and compact before you start to roll it into the shape of a ball, right? So that makes sure that the meat is nice and compressed and you don't have any air pockets in your meatball, which is not what you want. So there are two ways that I like to actually cook meatballs before I put them in the gravy or before I actually just put them on a sandwich or use them in some other way. Also, you can freeze your cooked meatballs as well, which we'll talk about too. You can bake the meatballs. So I've got a dozen here that I'm gonna actually put in the oven now and bake off and show you what those look like. When you bake a meatball, you're cooking the meatball all the way through, which means that you can use it for other things besides putting it in the gravy because it is cooked all the way through. The other way is to pan saute or sear the outside of the meatballs. When you do that, they get a lot of flavor, but they're not cooked inside, so you have to put them in your gravy and let them simmer and finish cooking all the way through. So unless you really split them open and finish cooking them on the stove like this, you really can't just eat a meatball or use it for freezing or anything like that when you do it on the stove, unless you really, like I said, split it open and finish cooking it. So in these go. They go for a total of 30 minutes, and halfway through at 15 minutes, I flip them over so that they get a nice brown crust on one side and also on another side. So I just take them out, use a pair of tongs, flip them over, put them back in, another 15 minutes, and then they're cooked through. So we'll take a look when they're ready and see what that looks like. While that's happening, we're gonna saute these meatballs. So I've got 5 meatballs here. I have some Pam in the bottom of my pan here. You can use olive oil. You can hear that pan is hot. You can hear the meatballs sizzling. Make sure that you start it off at least on medium heat and let the pan get a little hot before you put them in. Right? And my other recommendation is that you use a pan that's got kind of higher sides on it, because sometimes there's a lot of oil that comes out of the meatball itself from the meat, from the fat in the meat, along with whatever you're putting in the pan to make sure it doesn't stick. Make sure you're using a no-stick pan because meatballs will stick if you don't to the bottom of the pan. It can make quite the mess on your stove. So if you want to keep your stove clean, I would suggest something with a higher sides on it. And these will let go and turn on all sides until they're done. That should take 10 or 15 minutes. So what I'll do is I will work on these. I'll come back to you and I'll show you what they look like, and then we'll put them in the gravy. Our pan-fried meatballs have been frying about 5 minutes. I've been turning them and letting them fry off on all sides and kind of leaning them against each other in the pan. One thing I will tell you about this is don't crowd them in. You don't want your meatballs to sweat in the pan, and they'll do that. They will just steam if you put too many in the pan at one time. So just make sure that they have an inch or so apart of each other, and you have room to kind of move them around. You can see in this pan, hopefully you can see that a lot of oil has formed in the bottom of the pan. That's coming from the meatballs, like I said. So if you do use olive oil, don't put a lot of olive oil in here because you're going to end up with a lot of fat that you might not want. So like I said too, these meatballs are not cooked on the inside. You're only cooking them on the outside, and you're giving them a nice brown crust. If they're too loose, the meatballs will have a tendency to, kind of fall apart. This is where you're going to know it if they're too loose, is here when you're doing them this way. You won't necessarily be able to feel that in the baking process, but these are not. These are fine. My gravy is simmering away. Actually probably simmering a little too high, but make sure that your gravy is simmering before you put those meatballs in there because they are going to continue to cook. If you are putting meatballs that are from the oven into your gravy, of course you don't have to cook them anywhere near as long, just enough to give the gravy some flavor and get nice and immersed in there, but obviously there won't be any cooking going on, so it's the duration of time that you're cooking your gravy with the meat inside is less. So you can refer to my gravy video. I can put a link to it in the description on this video, and you can follow the instructions there in terms of how long you have to let your gravy simmer. But these are great. I'm going to put them in the gravy right now. Just take them out of here, and don't drop them too high up, or your gravy will splatter all over you. So get nice and down near the gravy. Put them in there. Snuggle them in. If you're doing them all, I think, what did I say? We had 17 quarter cup meatballs we got out of 2 pounds of meat. That's about how many you'll have if you do 2 pounds, and about half that with a pound. Give them a stir. Right. By this time, your gravy will have been simmering for quite a while, and tomatoes will be cooked. Maybe cook these another half hour, I would say, at the most, and they should be done. If you cook them longer than that, if you want the gravy to thicken up or anything like that, they're going to be fine. They will not decompose, in your gravy. Now, the one thing that my mother used to do, which you can take this or leave this according to your taste, is she would take this oil that come from the meat, and she'd actually put it in the gravy. And why not? It's not that much, so we're going to do that today. And hear it sizzle. And you just mix that in that oil, which is really just, the fat from the meat is going to go and give that gravy a really, really good flavor. So that's it for the pan-fried meatballs. All we have to do now is take a look at the meatballs that come out of the oven, and you will know everything that I know about making meatballs. So see you in a minute for this last and really fun step. So it's been half an hour. So our second batch of meatballs here are now cooked and ready to go into the gravy. As you can see, they are also nicely browned on 2 sides, and these meatballs are cooked all the way through. So let me see if I can get this meatball up there to see the nice crust. Okay. So at this point, if you just wanted to have meatball sandwiches, you want to have meatball subs. I know my brother Michael loves a good meatball sandwich, and it's few and far between. In our house, when we were kids, you weren't allowed to eat the meatballs without them being in the gravy. So Michael used to have to beg my mother to pan cook him a meatball for a meatball sandwich when she was making gravy. And most of the time he lost the battle because she wanted them all in the gravy, and I guess there weren't that many for the size family that we had, so she was being stingy with her meatballs. This is a great way to actually then let them cool, and then you can freeze them. You can freeze them individually. You can put them in a freezer bag and pop them in the freezer, and then you could actually first freeze them on a tray so that they individually freeze first, and then put them in the freezer bag so they don't stick together. That's really a better way to do it. Whatever you can do with the freezer space that you have. But then if you only say you're home by yourself and you only want 1 or 2 meatballs, or you want to warm them up for a sandwich, or you have some leftover macaroni or leftover sauce and you just want a few meatballs, you can take them out of the freezer and they'll be delicious once you defrost them and use them however you're going to do that. This method also, you'll see there's a lot of grease in here. This I would not recommend. I think it's a lot of grease when you do 12 meatballs like this, and I wouldn't put it in the gravy. You don't want to put a lot of that oil, although the flavor's really good. You don't want your gravy to be too oily. So just a little bit, maybe about a tablespoon is all I recommend. So however way you cook your meatballs. And if you're watching your calories, don't put any of that fat in your gravy. So that's it. We'll put them, drop them into the gravy, stir them all up, and we have ourselves a really nice meal for tonight. So I appreciate your watching. Michael, you now have the family meatball recipe on film. Feel free to share this recipe with anybody you would like. And again, look in the description for all the ingredient list. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave me a comment. So from my recipe box to yours, a great legacy gem meatball recipe. Thanks everyone, and take care.